Hi everyone, my name is Alexandra and welcome to this video series on biostatistics and research study designs. In this series, we'll be going over some of the basic components of designing a research study, and then we'll move on to discussing the three major types of observational studies. So these are descriptive studies, longitudinal studies, and heritability studies. We'll then discuss experimental studies, which are another major category of research studies. And finally, we'll discuss some ways that we can evaluate research studies using the Bradford-Hill criteria. We'll finish by going through a practice question that will give you all some tips and tricks for deciding what kind of study a question stem is describing. So let's get started by discussing the major goals of a research study. In a research study, we're interested in learning the relationship between variables. In healthcare specifically, we're often interested in the relationship between a variable and a health outcome, so that we can do more of things that optimize health outcomes and less of things that make health outcomes worse. So, for example, we might ask, does exposure to pesticides increase the risk of Parkinson's disease? If that's true, we would want to minimize that exposure. Another question we might be interested in is a new cancer therapy more effective than currently available treatments? In which case, we would want to make that therapy more widely available. Now let's discuss how we would go about designing a study for a question that we're interested in. Most research designs start with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated prediction about what might be going on. So let's go back to our Parkinson's disease and pesticides exposure example from before. You can imagine that a physician working in a rural clinic is noticing that their patients who are farmers are being diagnosed with Parkinson's more often than their patients who aren't. And let's say this physician goes into the literature and reads a bunch of research papers showing that pesticides can be toxic to the brain. This physician might come up with the hypothesis that exposure to pesticides increases the risk of Parkinson's disease. The next important component of a research study design is the independent variable. You can think of this as the hypothesized cause, so what we think is driving the effect that we're interested in. In our example from before, the cause that we are hypothesizing is driving the increased diagnosis of Parkinson's disease is the exposure to pesticides. So exposure to pesticides is our independent variable. In this pictogram here, which is representing a population of people that we might be studying, I've marked all of the people who have had exposure to pesticides with this glow around them. So I'll highlight that in green to make it a little bit easier to see. The next important component of a research study design is the dependent variable. You can think of this as the hypothesized effect, or the outcome that we're interested in studying. In our example from before, that outcome is diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So going back to our pictogram, in purple, we have folks who have no Parkinson's disease, and in red, we have folks with a Parkinson's disease diagnosis. The next important component of a research study design is the sample. The sample is the portion of your population of interest that is actually being included in the study. So in research, there's always a balance between what would be ideal to do to answer your question and what is actually feasible to do. So you can imagine for our Parkinson's study, it would be great if we could sample every single person in the world and see if they've had exposure to pesticides and then see if they have Parkinson's disease. But that would take a lot of time to do, and it would take a lot of money to do. So it's not logistically practical. So what we can do instead is consider our entire population of interest and try to get a representative sample of those people. So in our example, we might just look at farm workers in one state like California. The final concept I'd like to talk about is control. Controlling your study is a way to make sure that you're actually studying the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, and not the relationship of some variables that you're not interested in. The first thing you need to control for is your independent variable. This means you need to include both people with your proposed cause and people without it. In our example, we need to include both people with pesticide exposure and without pesticide exposure. That way we can compare the dependent variable between both groups, and there's context for what is going on in our exposure group. If we only included people with pesticide exposure in our study, and we saw that many of them were being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, unless we're able to compare that to people who were not exposed to pesticides and see that they had less Parkinson's disease, we could be inadvertently studying some other variable that we haven't taken into account, for example, age or genetic background. Which brings us to the next point of control. In a well-controlled study, all other potential variables are intentionally held constant so that you are only studying the relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable. So, for example, we know that Parkinson's disease is diagnosed more often in older age. So you can imagine if your pesticides exposure group included only people over the age of 60 and your non-pesticides exposure group included only people under the age of 40, you're not actually necessarily studying pesticide exposure, you're just studying age. So you need to account for those differences either in your data analysis or by intentionally grouping participants such that they're equally represented in both exposure groups. Now let's discuss the two major categories of research studies. The first is observational studies, which are really common in healthcare. In observational studies, researchers take their sample of people and simply observe what is happening. So one way to do this is to characterize patients based on the independent variable. So for example, in our sample here, we can group people either by having exposure to the pesticides or by not having exposure to the pesticides. And then you can measure the dependent variable. So in our pesticides exposure group, 2 people had Parkinson's disease, and in our non-pesticides exposure group, no people had Parkinson's disease. While this can certainly give us a lot of information about the relationship between pesticides and Parkinson's, something that's really important to remember is observational studies cannot determine causal relationships. This goes back to that concept of control we were talking about before. Because in an observational study, researchers are simply selecting participants and observing what is happening in their environment without changing anything or manipulating anything, it can be really difficult to control. This is in contrast to an experimental study, where the independent variable is directly manipulated by the researcher, and then the dependent variable is measured. So in our study, we would take a group of people who had never been exposed to pesticides, and we would assign half of them to become exposed and half of them to remain unexposed. And then we would see if the rates of Parkinson's disease diagnosis is higher in one group versus the other. Now, because as researchers, we are in control of how we assign participants to their exposure groups, these kinds of studies can determine causality because it's much easier to control for other variables. However, they're often ethically implausible. It would be extremely unethical to assign half of our study participants to an exposure we've already hypothesized to be harmful. In humans, experimental studies are typically only done when the exposure has been hypothesized to be beneficial to health outcomes. For example, in our second question example of, is a new cancer therapy more effective than current treatments, this kind of study could be run as an experimental study in humans.